At this point, I'd like to take the opportunity for all of you for coming, and specifically my field advisors, who have been, my field advisor, Mr. Stephen DeLay, who's currently stuck in traffic on 610 right now. Hopefully he'll be able to catch the second half. I'd also like to thank my faculty advisor, Mr. McNally, and my thesis advisor, Mrs. Harper. I'd also like to apologize for not having pizza for today, but these circumstances allow this. So, today we're going to be looking at an alternate model of reality. Paradigms exploring consciousness as the unfolder of the perceptible universe. Now, consciousness is something we're all very intimately familiar with and hopefully interact with on a day-to-day basis, yet seem to know very little about. In the views I'm going to present, consciousness is viewed and plays a much more integral role in the foundation for the existence of the universe than we give nearly enough credit for. In order to do this, I'm going to explain to everybody our current worldview from a scientific perspective, in order to familiarize everybody with how radically different the alternatives I'm going to present are. Then, we're going to step back and look at what we know, what it can mean, and where we go from there. From a scientific perspective, our current worldview is best summed up in two terms: material realism and determinism. Material realism is the idea that matter, hence only atoms and hence elementary particles, are real, and further, that everything about these particles, their momentums and positions, are able to be determined. These two views work great for describing classical physics and the world we live in and experience on a day-to-day basis. However, what does this have to do with consciousness? The problem is that material realism and determinism view consciousness from the idea of epiphenomenalism. This is the idea that consciousness is merely a subphenomena of these interacting particles. What about human experience, emotion, and creation? Is just as the interaction of physical particles and physical processes in the brain? And the answer, in the views I'm going to present, the answer is no. In looking at any system, it is generally beneficial to look to the building blocks of that system. In this case, the building blocks of consciousness, or what we think those are, is the quantum level. So we're going to begin by looking at the quantum level of reality, and then looking at how consciousness both affects and is affected by this level of reality. All these quantum phenomena I'm going to be describing are going to be very quick and brief, and not nearly enough explanation that these ideas deserve credit for. So with that disclaimer out of the way, let's begin with one of the most famous experiments in quantum mechanics of all time. This is known as the double slit experiment. In the double slit experiment, a medium is fired through two slits. In this case, we can use the examples of BBs or paintballs. So we can see the slits are narrow enough so that the bullets only have two options to go through: slit 1 on the left or slit 2 on the right. We're able to determine which slits they went through by the band of marks they leave behind. Now, even if they are shot out in a dispersed pattern, again, they only have two paths to go through, so they will leave a band of 2 marks. In the 1800s, scientists began doing this experiment with subatomic particles, and expected the same results, as these are still similar objects, just on a much smaller scale. However, before I share the results of the experiment, I'd like to familiarize everybody with the idea of waves and wave interference patterns. A wave is described as a propagating disturbance through any medium. If we take the case of the ocean, a wave propagates through the ocean, and the medium is water. It is a propagating disturbance and is described as sort of on and off or up and down behavior. If we look at the electromagnetic spectrum, we can see that radio waves, gamma waves, and other waves of this sort oscillate up and down in this on and off behavior. This also applies for circular wave patterns. In the case of skipping stones or throwing pebbles in a lake, we can see that the wave propagates outward in a circular pattern, forming points of low intensity and high intensity with crests and troughs. The other idea I'd like everybody to understand is the idea of wave interference. This is when two waves collide and interact and form an entirely different pattern. In this case, two waves are interacting, and their wave patterns will either react constructively or destructively, forming points of higher intensity and lower intensity respectively. So we can see towards the top of the picture, there's bands of high intensity and low intensity, or light and dark patterns. Now, I'm going to share with you the results of the experiment when performed with subatomic particles. Though this is a rough diagram, what scientists found was that the subatomic particles, when fired through the two slits, formed a wave interference pattern. Though the setup was the exact same, except on a much smaller scale, and the subatomic particles had only two paths to travel through, they formed a wave interference pattern. How was this possible? This led scientists to the idea of two new phenomena. One, that subatomic particles can behave as waves. This allows us to come to the idea of wave-particle duality. Nowadays, we know this to be true, and we view light from the idea of wave-particle duality, and the idea that individual packets of light, or particles of light known as photons, can interact as such, but they also interact as waves. This experiment first proved that. The other interesting thing about this experiment is that not only were these subatomic particles behaving as waves, but they were forming waves interacting with themselves in order to form a wave interference pattern. Keep in mind, when this experiment was done, they were firing these subatomic particles through the two slits with only two options, one at a time. In order for a wave interference pattern to be formed, the waves have to interact with other waves. What was the one particle interacting with it was passing through one at a time? In this diagram right here, we can see the progressive buildup marks behind the double slits. We can see they are fired through one at a time, and in the end, they still leave the result of a wave interference pattern. We see points of high intensity and points of low intensity. In this wave pattern, scientists they understood the idea of subatomic particles to exist in a sort of wave function. In this wave function, they found that subatomic particles exist in a sort of probabilities or tendencies to happen. In the points of bright light and these bands of bright light, you can see this is where they are most probably found to be, points of high probability of existence. In between these bands of bright light are bands of low or no light. This is where there was a low probability of these subatomic particles existing. Now, because of this strange phenomena going on in the double slit experiment, theoretical physicist Richard Feynman is quoted as saying, "This is a phenomenon which is impossible to describe in any classical way. All of quantum mechanics can be gleaned from carefully thinking through the implications of this single experiment." Because of this experiment, and as I briefly said before, scientists came to understand that subatomic particles have probabilistic existence. They do not exist as finite or discrete locations in space, but rather are represented by a wave function of probabilities, still with probabilities of high intensity and low intensity. In other words, if you'd like to find the location of a subatomic particle, you can only find where it will most likely be. In this graph right here, we have a demonstration of a wave function with points of high intensity and low intensity. The point of highest intensity is where the subatomic particle will most likely be. So as not to confuse the rhetoric of subatomic particle, I'm going to try to use as often as I can the term wavicle in order to show the wave-particle duality. Another interesting aspect the double-slit experiment proved to scientists was the idea of superpositions. Superpositions was the idea that in order to locate the position of a subatomic particle, as its wave function was represented traveling through any given medium, it is said to exist in a state of all possible states of probability as its wave function represents that. If we take the case of the double slit, right as the electron or subatomic particle is passing through the two slits, it is said to be in a superposition of existing simultaneously between both slit 1 and slit 2 in order to interact with itself and form the interference pattern. As the subatomic wavicle continues its trajectory, we can see its wave function spreads out, and if we'd like to find its position, we have to do that in terms of probabilities and locating the superposition of all the states it exists in simultaneously. Another interesting aspect of quantum mechanics is known as tunneling. Before I explain tunneling, I'd like to show you a brief animation. In this animation, a large patch of light approaches a barrier. If you can see on the right-hand side, a small patch of light appears on the other side. If you look closely, what's happening here is a group of subatomic wavicles are approaching the barrier. You can see the points of high intensity and low intensity as represented by the bands, the probabilities of where these subatomic wavicles most likely are. Now, what happens is as these group of subatomic wavicles is approaching the barrier, Although there's a high probability that many of them will stop right at the barrier or right before it, there exists a low probability as the wave function approaches that some of these subatomic wave pools will actually exist through and past this barrier. So this barrier is very real and definite, and works with barriers up to 1 to 3 nanometers in thickness. This is impossible to explain by any classical means again, as these subatomic wave pools are not physically passing through the barrier, leaving any marks. They are simply manifesting on the other side as a wave function, although with a low probability. The final aspect of quantum mechanics I'd like to touch on is the idea of entanglement and non-locality. Entanglement is a term many of you have heard, but may not be entirely familiar with its connotations. Entanglement is when two quantum particles sufficiently interact so that when they are separated, they appear to share similar properties. In order to demonstrate the weirdness of entanglement, physicist Elaine Aspect came up with an experiment in the mid-1900s to demonstrate this. Now, if a subatomic wavecle, it is said to be in a superposition of states at any given time. The same holds true for the properties of these subatomic wavecles. So, for example, photons have the property of either spin up or spin down. And again, until it is measured, it is said to be in a superposition with points of high and low probability of whether it is spin up or spin down. What Aspect did was he sufficiently entangled two photons and then separated them by an arbitrarily large distance. What he found was when he measured the superposed photon as having a spin up or spin down, its twin photon was found to exhibit the exact same spin. To him, this indicated that these two photons were somehow interacting or communicating, transmitting information. However, recently scientists have demonstrated that non-locality occurs at least 10,000 times the rate and speed of light. This is incredibly fast and leads scientists to believe that non-locality is in fact instantaneous. There is no transmittal or connection of information. Rather, these two photons or any subatomic particles are actually connected, and when you affect one, you are affecting the other. In this diagram, so like we see right here, we take a superposed photon, we measure its state as we spin up, observe it here. Its twin photon, even if it is an entirely different galaxy, will also be affected instantaneously. To represent the idea of non-locality, physicist David Bohm coined the term wholeness. What he meant by wholeness was that because subatomic particles have the potential to be entangled and form a connection, he believed that all subatomic particles are connected by some quantum level. In this view, all of quantum reality is part of an undivided connected whole with only apparent aspects of separateness. As this is a strange idea, he came up with an analogy known as the fish tank analogy. In this analogy, two cameras are placed on either side of an aquarium. One camera is facing the front, the other the side. To an independent observer, these two fish will appear to interact very differently. The movements, and especially the movements in relation to their environment, will be very different and appear to be two different fish or two different aspects of a system. However, as we know, this is just one fish with two different aspects. In viewing David Bohm's idea of wholeness, he views the actual fish, or the undivided whole, as the implicate order, and he views the apparent separateness as the explicit order, the two separate fish. This is how he explains ideas of non-locality. He claims that there's an actual connection existing on a fundamental level here. So how do we view individual wavicles or individual wave functions existing within David Bohm's idea of wholeness? Quantum chemist Ira Levine came up with two analogies. We view drops of water in a larger body of water. We can view each independent wavicle as a drop of water. It behaves independently and otherwise minds its own business. However, whether it is in or out of the water, it is still part of the interconnected whole, an undivided portion of the larger body of water it exists in. We can also look to the example of the rope. We view each individual wavecle as a strand in a rope. We can see it behaves independently and has its own independent aspects. Yet regardless of its independent behavior, it is part of an undivided whole in which it serves one function in one whole undivided rope. The rope is the implicate order, while the individual strands are the apparent, separate, and explicit order. So as we can see here, subatomic wavefools either exist in realms of probability, as we've seen in the wave function, which is known as the realm of potentia, or realms of finite definite points, known as actualization. But what occurs in between these 2 points? My field advisor, Stephen DeLay. So what occurs between these 2 points? As we can see, there's clearly a transition between a probability and existing in a finite location. We know electrons and photons to exist as finite points because we can observe them, and we know from our TVs, from firing of electrons, they behave as independent points. However, what governs the transition between existing as a range of probabilities and finite points? The phenomena that describes this is known as the collapse of the wave function. In the collapse of the wave function representing the probability distribution of all the possibilities and the superpositions of the subatomic particle are collapsed into a definite point, and this allows the subatomic particle to exist as a finite definite location. However, what role does the observer play in quantum mechanics? Many of you may have heard the idea of observership in quantum mechanics, but how does it relate? If we wanted to know what slit, returning to the double slit experiment, if we wanted to know what slit exactly the electrons went through, what if we were to place a detector to see which slit they went through? We know that they exist in a superposed state between slit 1 and slit 2, but can we really show that on a camera? Can we show one electron being in 2 places? In order to find out which slit these electrons went through, scientists attempted doing the double slit experiment, however, with detectors on the slits. What they found was that the typical expected 2-band pattern was formed. When observed, the electrons behaved as classical physics would dictate, forming a 2-band pattern. Now, many scientists, this is known as the measurement postulate, the idea that you can't measure or interact with a subatomic particle without affecting it. In this case, affecting it by collapsing its wave function. Many scientists claim the measurement postulate to exist simply because it's the measuring apparatus, in this case that of the camera's apparatus, affecting these subatomic particles and changing their trajectory as they're going through the 2 slits. However, scientists have again repeated the double slit experiment with detectors that detect which slit the subatomic wavepool went through after the experiment is done. The experiment is left to its own, and the tens of thousands of subatomic wavepools pass through the slits and leave their marks on the pattern. However, this pattern is not known yet. The detectors then are able to see retroactively which slits the electrons went through. Even with retroactive detection, the electrons still form a 2-band pattern. So time did not seem to be a factor here in how the electrons were behaving, whether they were behaving as probability distributions or as finite points. So what did this mean? To many scientists, this meant that there was one variable left. The idea of conscious states affecting the subatomic particle's existence. By conscious state, they of course mean the idea of an observer. Not the fact that they are being watched, but the fact that we are affecting their actions. Now, it's difficult to describe consciousness, and especially conscious states, as they result to us. So, to describe self-consciousness, many scientists use the ideas of being able to choose. Further, being able to be aware that we choose. So, we can choose and affect the way subatomic wavepools interact. This is known as the conscious collapse of the wave function, as it appeared to be our consciousness which was affecting the collapse. So what does the conscious collapse of the wave function mean? Well, there are a variety of interpretations ranging from the Copenhagen, transactional, objective collapse, many worlds, de Broglie-Bohm, consciousness causality collapse, and consciousness as collapse theories. I will be focusing on 2. The conscious causality collapse theory and consciousness as collapse. One of the biggest ideas in conscious causality collapse is the idea of monistic idealism, posited by physicist Amit Goswami. In this view, Goswami says that existing as part of an undivided and implicate whole in relation to subatomic wavepools could imply our effect on such quantum particles. He says this relation is that the collapse consists not of doing something to objects, but of choosing and recognizing the results of that choice. He goes further to say that every observation makes a causal pathway in the fabric of possibilities of the transcendent domain of reality. In this case, the transcendent domain of reality he's referring to is the reality of wholeness and potentia, in which we make choices from and navigate through the fabric of possibilities. Thus, if we actualize reality through observations, who is actualizing the universe? Are we actualizing the reality of distant galaxies and stars? Monistic idealism says that because we can collapse wave functions as conscious beings, we are part of a whole or non-local consciousness that collapses and experiences the universe. In this view, non-local consciousness encompasses empirical reality. We can see in this diagram, non-local consciousness encompasses the entirety of the perceptible universe. Non-local consciousness actualizes empirical reality, which in turn and in part gives rise to our individual consciousness, as we are undoubtedly part of empirical reality. However, the important thing here to note is that our individual consciousness is linked to non-local consciousness. Thus, non-local consciousness and individual consciousness together comprise empirical reality, making empirical reality conscious content. The other view I'm going to present views consciousness as the collapse of the wave function. This view is known as panpsychism, and panpsychism states that all is literally consciousness. As the wave function collapses, this gives rise to consciousness. So all the actualization you see around you is consciousness, and the universe is comprised of consciousness. Noted panpsychist Gerhard Brunschrup is quoted as saying, "It's difficult to imagine how mind or consciousness could suddenly emerge and evolve out of something that did not possess it. How could it suddenly emerge if it was not present in some proto-form before?" In panpsychism, individual units of actualization, or collapses, are units of experience. Every collapse is a unit of consciousness, and each subatomic particle is therefore a proto-consciousness or proto-mind, and every collapse is a proto-experience. The way panpsychism describes the conscious collapse of the wave function is as follows. The conscious collapse of the wave function occurs because our consciousness is interacting with the most basic level of reality, thus forming the smallest potential or occasion of experience. As this smallest potential or occasion of experience of collapse as this experience of collapse contributes to our consciousness, reality is comprised of experiences themselves. So in this view, every time a subatomic particle actualizes, a basic unit of experience or consciousness is formed. This view leads us to believe that the entire universe is comprised of individual units of consciousness. However, this begs the question, how are we comprised of quadrillions, if not more, units of consciousness to form our individual awarenesses? This is similar to the biological question of how can quadrillions of cells come together to form our experience as individual consciousness. The other question panpsychism begs is the human consciousness differentiation. How is our consciousness as individual human beings different from the consciousness of, say, the cushions on the bleachers, or even the ground? These are still, our bodies and the ground are still collections of individual units of consciousness. Yet what makes this different? This is an unanswered question in panpsychism, but scientists Stort and Hammerhoff may have come up with an interesting model to describe it. This is known as orchestrated objective reduction. In this model, and usually in describing consciousness, scientists look to neuronal activity in the brain, how neurons interact to form conscious experiences. However, Stort and Hammerhoff look towards the building blocks of neurons, microtubules. Within microtubules, there are protein chains. Then these protein chains, they're either ionized or deionized electrons. These patterns of electrons form the proteins, which in turn magnify and amplify the scale to form our brains. Stort and Hammerhoff claim that sometimes these electrons exist in a superposed state of existing simultaneously as both ionized and deionized. As panpsychism claims that when actualization occurs, conscious experience arises, they claim that when these superposed electrons are reduced to either an individual state of ionized or deionized electrons. They magnify and amplify up the scale to form a solidified and finite protein, and in turn a finite microtubule, which in turn is a finite neuron, which may give rise to our conglomerate conscious human experience. Thus, in comparing monistic idealism and panpsychism, we can see that monistic idealism views the universe in terms of conscious content, the conscious content of how our individual and non-local consciousness interacts to form empirical reality. Panpsychism views the entire universe as consciousness as the actualizations of empirical reality. So where do we go from here? There are still many unanswered questions in both of these theories. Namely, the brain-mind problem. We don't exactly know how or why our consciousness is located in the brain, or the nature of this experience. So I believe more research needs to be done into the exact correlation between how consciousness is centralized in our brain. Secondly, I believe an increased understanding is needed as into the conscious collapse of the wave function. Though we see they are correlated, there might be other factors or variables involved that allow us to perceive the wave function as a result of our consciousness. So I believe more research needs to be done in this field. Noted author David Chalmers is noted as saying, "The temptation to link the mysteries of quantum mechanics and consciousness is magnified by how deeply tied the notion of observership is to quantum mechanics, crucially involving the relation between a subject's experience and the rest of the world. While it is easy to picture a universe free of consciousness, the picture monistic idealism and panpsychism pose is that such a system could not exist without an awareness to experience it. Thus, non-local consciousness or individual units of consciousness cut themselves into a subject and object, an experiencer and something to experience." So today, I've briefly touched on very important principles in quantum mechanics and examined two possible interpretations of these implications, and indicated that more research needs to be done to truly assert the validity of these theories. Whether we exist or affect some fundamental level of probabilistic reality, I think one of the most important things that can be taken away from quantum mechanics is to be grateful and amazed that we live in an apparently finite natural reality, not one of potentia and probability. Thank you. I'm sure everybody has some questions. Did you invent the word waveable? Not.
Well, I asked Sarah, but would you talk a little bit about your internship and where did you?
Oh, my internship wasn't related to my.
Okay, well then your field.
Yeah, Stephen, he's been great. He actually, I found him through a Rice University Consciousness Conference, and after meeting with him, he was able to give me some great resources and books relating to my topic, and he was really good for helping me bounce off ideas and theories off of, and definitely in reviewing my work. So, yeah.
And are you a professor at Rice?
I'm a graduate student.
Right. Well, okay. So, is it possible, or did you come? I don't know how to ask this, but that maybe the brain or the mind is really a translator or processor for information that's coming from other parts of the heart or whatever. Did you run into that?
I didn't run into anything like that, but there's definitely the possibility that our individual consciousness is a translator of sorts. As you saw in monistic idealism, our individual consciousness may not be an individual phenomenon in itself, but it's a translator for non-local consciousness to experience the content which it actualizes. So it may function as a translator of a sort in that sense.
So I'm pretty clear on the nature of how monistic idealism requires the individual consciousness as a participator in the actualization of reality itself being transcendent thereof. But what is not clear to me, and I haven't heard it or seen it articulated very clearly to me, is how panpsychism addresses that type of issue. And positing consciousness as a singularity, so to speak, it is that it's unclear. Is it simply sub-bundles like atoms of consciousness that are not aggregate as a whole, or are they viewed as an aggregate whole? And if so, then how or why is there even the apparent need or semblance of subspecies thereof, or smaller units thereof? You see what I'm saying? Because at a certain point, a certain conglomeration of these individual consciousness particles or wavicles or whatever you want to call them, why would it even divide itself? Because it being the thing doesn't require the same modi of realization. That's something that is transcendent of an apparent existing reality would require. If all it is consciousness, it doesn't seem that it would need itself to actualize what it already is. You see what I'm saying?
I believe I do see what you're saying. If I answered incorrectly, help me refine your question. You are correct, yeah. Panpsychism definitely posits that reality is comprised of individual units of consciousness. Now, sort of the big picture conglomerate consciousness you're talking about, this could be, the ideas of implicate and explicate whole can still exist within the ideas of panpsychism. So there could be an implicate, sort of raw consciousness, right? Just one undivided whole consciousness that then divides itself into subject and object of individual conscious experiences. Now, as to why there needs to be an experiencer and something to experience, which I believe was the second part of your question, I'm not sure. But what I do know is that both monistic idealism and panpsychism posit that there needs to be a sort of subject and object, and the universe at some level, whether it's non-local consciousness or by other means, cuts itself into two in order for this to happen. At least happen on the explicate level. On the implicate level, there's no cutting or dividing. Even in panpsychism, the conglomerate consciousness is all there is. There's no cutting. But
are there theorizations as to why that apparent cuts might come about? You know what I mean? Like, again, from the monistic idealistic, I feel like the explanation of why this occurred, I get it. Whether I agree with it or not, like, I see the need for that to happen. But with panpsychism, it doesn't. I haven't seen anybody clearly articulate why that may be. And I don't.
Why the cutting
encountered
occurs.
much. Yeah. Like if there's an ocean of consciousness, why would it? How or what's the need for it to be drops of consciousness?
That's a question I can't answer, nor did I encounter in any readings. Yeah, no, but that's a great question.
When you were talking about waves, is there any relevance to vibrations with that? Are waves
Absolutely.
do they have a physical influence?
Do they have a physical influence on what?
On like a physicality of I guess everything around them. Like, do they have an influence on things? Or are they just kind of
Sounds like you're asking two questions. First of all, waves definitely possess a vibratory-like property. As we can see in their frequency, that's a vibration of sorts. The vibration through what medium depends on where the wave is interacting. But they're absolutely vibratory in nature, and this vibratory nature is expressed in probabilities. The probabilities of the vibrations of where it is most likely to exist. But, sorry, what was the second part of your question?
does it have a physical influence on things?
What do you mean on things?
Is there a physical manifestation thereof? I think that's what it's asking.
Okay.
Like can you see a physical
Or a cause and
manifestation of a
effect
wave?
kind of thing?
Yeah, could it affect anything? Could it affect it, or is it just solely its own vibration?
Well, in the idea of non-locality, you see that everything is absolutely connected, at least at some level. So nothing truly functions independently. So the wave absolutely affects other wavicles or particles, depending on what state of potential or actualization they're in. It depends, I guess, in the proximity of that.
Okay.
I believe I answered that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Is it reasonable, from my understanding, to call this great consciousness or spirit or God, whatever we choose to believe? It's kind of that was there eternally before and always will be, and basically created this world and this matter. And is that kind of what I got lost in some of the in some of the theories, but I'm kind of seeing it that way. Is that a summary that works for me anyway?
Right. Well, I don't use the term God very intentionally because that's a very weighted word. But if you're referring to non-local consciousness and the undivided whole of consciousness, and if you're asking if time is a factor when you're saying has it always been around, as we can see in the quantum unconnected level, we see a glimpse into the implicate order, and that time doesn't affect quantum particles in the same way. We can see through retroactive observation that doesn't make any sense through any classical means. So because time doesn't affect quantum, the quantum level in the same way, it would make sense that in the implicate whole of non-local consciousness, time would not be a factor. So as far as always will and always will be, that's definitely a fair assumption.
And that which created matter. Was here before matter? Or directs matter, I guess is what...
Well, I mean, when you ask the questions, when it created matter, if it created matter, I mean, those are time-centric questions. They're centered around the idea of time, and it's difficult to wrap our minds around the idea of time not existing. So, when you're speaking of non-local consciousness, I don't know if it's proper to ask the question of when it created matter.
But it seems to have an effect on matter as we know it.
Well,
That's
definitely.
kind of the point of...
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Do you think that microtubules are a testable hypothesis? And if so, how do you see those kind of being investigated, like the superpositioning?
How do I see like the ionized and deionized
Yeah,
electrons?
is it even possible?
Is it
especially
testable?
with the kind of
Well, I think
observer position?
probably
Right.
advancements in biotechnology could definitely allow us to investigate that further. I think the problem is that in looking at any quantum system, it's often embedded with trillions of other quantum wavicles. So it's difficult to isolate individual wavicles. So especially in the brain, right? I think if it were possible to actually segregate an individual, protein, and then from there, if it was possible to just see the effects of one electron in the protein, then I think that's definitely a testable hypothesis that would prove and a lot, and it would change how we view a lot of things. The problem is, I don't know, if you are able to isolate and single out the electron that builds up the protein, it might not have the same effect as it magnifies and amplifies, as once you've separated it, it's no longer part of the protein. It may not give rise to the same phenomenon.
You have some environment.
Right, so I have no idea how you could study something like that. But certainly I think with biotechnology and separating individual microtubules and proteins might be the next step in that.
I need a little bit of help understanding the panpsychism. I think I get how the monistic idealism works. It makes
Okay.
philosophy synthetic around that kind of thing for a while. But so if each of the individual units of the world are their own little consciousnesses, and I myself am a consciousness and also a composite of a bunch of little consciousnesses, and I'm observing the thing, what's the, and I assume this was in your presentation, I just didn't pick up on
It
it,
might
but
not have been.
what's the connection between me having observed it? How does that explain the observer effect on...
How does it explain the
How does
conscious collapse of the
panpsychism
wave function?
explain what monistic idealism explains in a different way?
Which is the conscious causality connection?
Yes.
Right. Well, that I don't understand too well, and I actually never explicitly found in my readings, but I was able to sort of extrapolate my own ideas on why this would occur, right? If we're interacting with individual consciousnesses as conglomerate consciousness, why does the collapse of the wave function occur? Is that what you're asking? What I believe, and what I have written down, is that because our consciousness is interacting with the most fundamental unit or level of reality, right? The level of reality where it's decided whether a unit of consciousness is present or not, whether it's potentialized or actualized, right? When you're interacting with that sort of midway level, I think the experience of interacting causes the smallest unit of experience, which gives rise and explains why we're experiencing that as conscious, conglomerate conscious beings. I don't know if that's a fair explanation, but does that make any sense?
Kind of. Is it kind of like, again, if we're just extrapolating sort
Sure.
of from what the theory sounds
Sure,
like, if I am a consciousness, or at least a shorthand, I can call myself a consciousness, but I'm actually a bunch of little consciousnesses. When I say me doing things as if all these little things working together, and then my brain state is affecting that thing, is it fair to say that this is consciousness, and that little air particle is conscious, and that's conscious, and that's conscious, and that thing right there, that double slit experiment, is conscious, if that me, that coordination of consciousnesses that happens all the time, that I call that me, is extending into that, so that in a kind of analogous way, I'm kind of making that happen in the way that I move my finger, because my consciousness is extending that way. Okay. Really couldn't keep that as full.
Again, this is just extrapolated from what I understand.
In his paper, it's kind of well because it's such a simple thing that it's going to sort of behave how we expect it to do because we're so much more complex. But I can't superposition the table because it's a larger aggregation of these smaller things. If I have any influence at all, it's only at these very teeny tiny basic levels. I thought in your paper you did a pretty good job of explaining
I
that.
did. Yeah.
Like, why can't I flip the table and do a different superposition of states? Or like walk through the empty space of the wall, which theoretically should be possible if I time it just right.
But highly improbable, and I guess the more things you add...
Yeah, so that's
right.
somewhat what they speculated.
So I guess in that terms, it's the idea of degrees of potentia. Aggregates of larger and larger consciousness might have progressively increased effect on smaller and smaller units of consciousness. So we might be able to affect the most basic level of reality where consciousness may or may not be present, when it's just actualizing as one waveable, but maybe not more than that.
Is there an idea for like nothing or non-space? Is there a place where consciousness doesn't exist in these theories?
Let me think about that. I don't think so. I don't think there's room for that in these theories. Simply because these theories posit consciousness in one way or the other as the overarching hierarchy that structuralizes everything.
Do they make an assumption about space being finite or infinite?
I think the question of whether space is finite or infinite is more of a question of whether non-local consciousness is finite or infinite. Because it's saying space is a result of right. So whether non-local consciousness is finite or infinite, again, that's pure speculation. So
Have you heard anything about torsion wave theory?
torsion wave theory. Potentially? Could you explain it to me?
It's like going in that stuff for this one. I wrote it down because I was reading a book and it had to do with the non-locality we're talking about,
Sure.
and how wave pools, or whatever it was, move 10,000 times the speed of light.
Right.
And these Russian scientists were working on, I can't think of the names, but it was basically like these things like captured information. And they had like a spin on it, and they weren't bound by time. And
Right. This is the exact thing I was talking about earlier. In Aspect's experiment, he separates the photons, right, and then measures the spin. So if are you asking if time is a factor in measuring the superimposed states of two entangled photons or subatomic wavefuls?
I don't know. Just ask you.
I've never heard of torsion wave theory. I'm just trying to interpret your
You
question.
definitely enjoy it.
I would enjoy it. I'll let it. Hold on. Never mind, this marker doesn't work. Remind me later.
Okay, one last step. How, in what ways does panpsychism differ from philosophical idealism? If everything's just consciousness, is there even matter at all? Does there need to be matter? What's the point of matter? Or is it all just, you know what I mean? Philosophic idealism being sort of the Western notion, we're bound by the concept of material realism, where it's all just matter and consciousness is sort of an epiphenomenalism. Well, there's a flip version of that I would say is not quite as sophisticated as monistic idealism, but called idealism, where, it's all just mind, or idea, right? That there is no physical component to yours at all. Does panpsychism go that far to say there is no physicality, or does it still posit a physical component to existence, or do they just sort of
here's the one thing I'm not sure, because I ran into idealism a lot in reading about these, and I'm not sure whether idealism posits that everything is conscious content or everything is consciousness, right? And that's the main debate between these two theories. As far as panpsychism, it doesn't, because it's also a monistic theory, right? That there's only one thing, consciousness. However, it says that, I'm sorry, the one thing is not consciousness. It says that matter and consciousness are essentially the same thing. They develop in parallel. So in other words, as matter is actualized, a conscious experience arises from that. So if we see the level of potentia here, potentia, as it's actualized, it forms. Oh. As this level of potential is actualized, it's twofold in its actualization. One is the actual literal result of that actualization, which might be a finite particle, like an electron. The other result of this actualization is a unit of consciousness. So when it stems from potentia, a unit of consciousness correlates and develops in parallel with the actualization of the particle. So it doesn't discredit matter as real. It just says that they develop in parallel.
Well, wait, then what's potentia?
Potentia is just the level of probability, where there's no actualization.
Sounds like a deeper level of consciousness.
Potentia has consciousness. Can't wrap my head around that right now.
So based on that, like, in a philosophical view, one could say, I say this based upon, like, our awareness of consciousness, like, consciousness could have arose from that, like, pure state of potential because it had the potential to be realized.
So why does it arise from the pure state of potentia?
Like, could it have? It's,
What causes it to arise from potential? In other words, why is anything actualized at all? Like, why isn't everything just in a realm of potential?
no, consciousness we know, like, could that have formed because it had the potential to be realized?
I think the answer to that question is yes, but not on the level that we experience in empirical reality. The answer to that question, I believe, is yes, but it had the potential to be realized on the level of the individual unit of consciousness. So it had the potential to be realized on the level of a single waveform, or single unit of consciousness. I don't think the potential to be realized as a conglomerate consciousness was instantly realized, and I think it took, if the idea of the evolution of the universe and biological mutations is credible,
Time of the chapter.
definitely is, then we can say that no, that idea definitely, the potential for that to be realized did not happen rapidly at all. I mean, first, in the beginning of the universe, perhaps just the basic levels of units of consciousness were realized, right? Individual waveables. But as higher potential arose, higher levels of consciousness and configurations and complex systems of consciousness were evolved, as we can see in more complex configurations of matter, and I mean matter parentheses consciousness because panpsychism says there's the same thing, and higher and more complex configurations of biological systems, more complex consciousness in terms of more complex brains. Does that help answer? A little bit? Okay. So,
Well, what disciplines or whatever study this? I mean, your field advisors in philosophy, what are some of the areas that encompass this study? Do you know?
that encompass this study.
How are you
I
gonna get a
think-
job?
I think that's probably a twofold answer. And these theories, they combine the ideas, as I said, they combine the ideas of quantum mechanics and of consciousness.
Right.
So I think the field, it's not a single field of study unless you're talking about individual theories, right? Like monistic or panpsychism. But I think the two fields of studies would be viewing whether or not consciousness consists of everything, viewing consciousness as an independent phenomena, which is what phenomenology posits, I believe, which is what my field advisor is studying. And the other field of study would just be non-classical interpretations of quantum mechanics. Because classical interpretations of quantum mechanics, there's still very hard-struck scientists that view, this collapse of the wave function as not really real, and they claim that there's variables acting that guide the wave function. There's no actual collapse, it's just apparent. So I believe non-classical interpretations of quantum mechanics and realms such as phenomenology would be the two fields of study related to this.
Thanks, I mean, this is like, I'm wondering who you're gonna hang out with. Where are you
I
gonna
wonder that
find
too
those
sometimes.
There tends to be an intersection between like philosophy, psychology, brain, cognitive scientists.
Right, well, that's.
And they all are kind of fusing into
Very
this
cool.
philosophy of mind kind of camp that kind
And
of
spirituality.
transcends all of this. Because they're all stemming the same thing, so it's really interesting to see how it
Well,
all comes
and
together.
then one thing, just because a lot of you have seen I Am, is this an example of the whole yogurt thing, maybe?
The what?
The yogurt experiment in the movie I Am? Is this
I
related?
didn't watch that movie.
Okay, never mind. There are a lot of people here that did, that's why I was trying to connect it to something that was like, look at me.
It might be related to yogurt.
Yogurt is a fundamental.
Yogurt might be conscious.
What they did with the yogurt in the.
No, I mean I can look into that again
Well,
if
don't
I
look
find
up
a pen.
yogurt, just watch the movie.
Okay.
It's a little bit different. It's a little bit different.
It's just, okay.
Only a little bit. It doesn't have to do with waves, but it's more electricity. It's weird. I'll explain it later.
All right. Thanks,
Connor,
Nate.
what was that thing about torsion?
Torsion wave theory.
Torsion wave theory and yogurt experiment. Okay. Miss Eames.
So, this is a lot of things to wrap my head around. But when you were talking about this view of wholeness, does it relate to, of the two, I guess, pedagogies or schools of thought or practice, panpsychism and
Monistic idealism.
yes. Does the viewpoint of wholeness that you were talking about in your presentation, does that relate to the panpsychism or
It relates to both.
to
absolutely.
both? Okay.
Because both panpsychism and monistic idealism are interpretations of quantum mechanics.
I see.
And the idea of wholeness is sort of thought to be just one facet of quantum mechanics, just the undivided, interconnected potential.
I'm curious about that intersection with philosophy. In your research, did they ever bring up any of the names in Western philosophy, specifically, I see a lot of Hegel in this monistic idealism or possible conversation of existentialists from the 20th century kind of having some problems with this. Like, I guess, with the philosophizing, they're trying to figure out exactly what the implications for this would be. Like, everything is conscious. What the heck does that mean? Well, we have people who have been dealing with that before they had the science to ever back up those kinds of claims. So
Right.
I wonder if this is bringing philosophy, those forms of philosophy into science. Are you saying that? Or any scientists moving towards the 19th and 20th century philosophers for answers?
I haven't seen any relation to 19th or 20th century philosophers, but in terms of panpsychism and relating to Western thought, the idea of panpsychism wasn't exactly new, and it's been around since, I believe, Leibniz's monadology, in which he described individual monads comprised everything. And these monads simply were different aspects of totality, some possessing consciousness, and therefore, implying that some didn't possess consciousness as well. So these individual monads possessed everything. And that related to panpsychism. I haven't seen any connections to Western philosophy, but almost all of the research I followed made some connection to Eastern philosophy in terms of Taoism or things like that, as it relates to the undivided whole and nature of things. But not so much Western philosophy. And I think that the reason for that is Western philosophy views things... Well, Western philosophy, I think, it was primarily founded around, sort of scientific perspectives, but still from a philosophical viewpoint, from this sort of mechanistic material manner. But I never saw any relations to that in my readings.
Okay, well I'd look at Hegel then,
Okay.
because one of the biggest voices in 19th century philosophy, who was definitely into this idea of this whole you being you and me being me is just it being confused, that is the absolute spirit
Right.
slowly coming to realize its own existence.
Right.
That's great.
Well, yeah, and that's what a lot of them did say. But again, I saw that in Eastern philosophy they mentioned. So yeah.
Okay, so when you're talking about the observer effect, I feel like it seems to imply that there were possibly limits to our understanding, that by the act of observing we were tainting what we were observing. And also, you mentioned that more research was needed. And so I'm wondering if in the future, with quantum physics, if we start to, reach limits of understanding, what do we do when we can't do more research? It doesn't help us understand anymore.
What do we do when we can't do any more research? Well, if we haven't done any more research, I would hope we've come to a conclusion.
Well, I mean, as I said, I feel like if there are limits to our understanding in the quantum world, what do we do?
Okay,
when
okay.
Yeah.
I mean, the only answer I can give you is continue to speculate. I mean, if you can't truly isolate consciousness as a variable in the observer effect, you mean? Like, if research just simply can't be done, we can't research it past that. I mean, that's hopefully a problem for the 22nd and 23rd century, but besides continue to speculate, I'm not sure how to answer.
The yogis from way back in Tibet, they talk about this. And the one we saw in the place we went in California, consciousness being first. Even in the Bible, first